Hi, guys, and welcome back to this lecture number 5, wherein we are going to cover PLSQL control structures. Flow control and control structures in PLSQL are just not that very different from what you're going to find in your standard programming languages. So we're going to bounce through this pretty quickly, particularly the if-then-else case, that sort of thing. But where we are going to take a look and understand a little more is where we get into both implicit as well as explicit cursor for loops, because those are pretty powerful and pretty distinct to PLSQL. That being said, let's jump inside and take a look at some flow control in PLSQL. For those following along, we're going to be looking at lecture 5. The content there. So open up that resource and let's get started. See you on the inside.
Okay, not surprisingly, we're going to start at the beginning with a very simple if statement. Syntax is really easy. We start with the keyword if, add a Boolean conditional, and culminate with the keyword then. We then include at least one executable line of code and culminate the block with the end if keyword. Now, of course, the executables only execute if the Boolean conditional is true. In our little example here, we're outputting the classic hello world to the DBMS output buffer. Hey, in case I hadn't mentioned it previously, you can open that window under the View menu option. To execute this little snippet of code, I simply selected it all with Control-A and then hit this little Run Script icon. F5 is the equivalent hotkey for those of you who are into hotkeys. We now, of course, move on to the if, else if, else, and if syntax. Again, this should all be very old hat for you guys. We first check the if conditional, and if it evaluates to true, we execute the code in that section and exit. If it evaluates to false, we check the conditional associated with the first else if clause. Again, if it evaluates to true, we execute the associated code and exit. False, we continue until we reach the optional else clause. The else code executes only if none of the above conditionals return to true. We, of course, close the if statement with the end if keywords. Again, I hope this is really easy stuff for all you guys, because we're going to fly through this stuff later on when we look at real-world code. If this isn't super easy, then I suggest you study like crazy in this part, because the real-world code is going to just kill you if you don't get this stuff just down cold. Oh, by the way, did you notice the odd spelling of else if keyword? Apparently that's a leftover from PLSQL's origins in the Ada programming language. Don't know, never really coded in Ada myself. All right, now we look at a case statement with an associated selector variable. Here we're going to evaluate the value of our selector variable, in our case test, against each of the consecutive where clauses until a true condition is met. As soon as a true condition is met, the associated code is executed and the control flow exits. If no when clause evaluates to true, then the optional else clause code is executed in a fashion similar to the else clause found in an if-then statement. Again, painfully easy stuff. Just remember to close that with an end case syntax. Our next example lets us get a little more sophisticated with our case statement. While our previous example was limited to testing the value of a single variable, this syntax allows us to test any level of Boolean complexity. New syntax here, but I think we all agree this is pretty straightforward stuff, and you've probably seen similar syntax in your previous languages. Okay, moving on, we are now going to look at a simple loop construct. The control will enter the loop and cycle there until it encounters an exit statement. The exit statement can include an optional conditional statement. Check out how the continue keyword immediately suspends execution of the current cycle and returns flow control back to the loop start. Now, guys, this is a reasonably inelegant flow control mechanism. The only time I really see it used is with reference cursors and dynamic SQL. We'll take a look at an example of that later on in this course, and it'll make more sense then. Generally, you don't see this guy used. It's just too crude. All right, now we move on to the while loop syntax. This loop is going to execute until a conditional is met. In our example, all the code contained within the loop will execute until the length of the loop control variable reaches 5. All right, think about this. Anybody want to tell me why the actual last string output was 5 characters long? That's right, of course, the length of the string was only 4 when it was last tested, and then the embedded code executed once more, making the string 5 characters in length. Always one of those things you got to be careful with when you're dealing with a while loop, because it's very often the case that the code will execute one more time than you maybe have planned. All right, now we're moving on to some more commonly used control structures. Of course, the if and case statements are used regularly, but the for loop added a certain elegance sometimes lacking in the while and those unconditional loops. You don't want to play with those things. With a for loop, you set up what is known as a loop control variable, or LCV, and increment it through a range of values executing the contained code throughout each pass of the loop. Here our loop control variable is incrementing by the default value of 1 from 2 through 5 inclusive, while we print out the control counter and LCV variables to the DBMS output buffer. We'll use this structure a lot when we get to the real world code. But by the way, you can specify that you like the LCV to walk the range in reverse, but you cannot specify an alternative increment. To affect a different increment value, you kind of got to play a little trick similar to this syntax. Okay, now we're going to move on to an example where we use an explicit cursor as the range limiter to our loop. Here, for each execution of the outer loop, the entire inner loop is realized. In short, you're creating the entire LCV2 set for each instance of LCV1. Although we're using an integer range here in our outer loop, it too could have utilized a cursor, at which point we would have been creating the combination of 2 sets. Alternatively, we could have used an implicit cursor wherein the select statement is actually written directly into the range syntax of the loop in a fashion similar to this. This is my standard way of setting up a loop bound by a select. Very common usage and pretty elegant. All right, gang, that pretty much concludes our quick tour of PLSQL control structures. I know we went through these very quickly on the premise that this should have been reviewed for most of you, but if it wasn't, please take your time and go back over this code in detail, because we're going to assume this stuff is just second nature to you when we get to the real code. Let's get out of here and take a look at a summary.
All right, wasn't that fun? I know it was a little redundant with respect to your other programming languages, but there are some interesting syntactical things with respect to flow control and PLSQL that we had to go over. So let's review what we learned. We started with the if, then else syntax. Remember that odd spelling of the else if, E-L-S-I-F. Apparently the missing E is some sort of holdover from the Ada programming language. Don't know, never played there, so it's just something you got to memorize. Next, we looked at the case syntax. Remember, we could do that against a variable or with conditionals associated with each of the when clauses. Again, really straightforward stuff. I'm sure you've seen it before. then went on to the simple loop syntax, really not very commonly used. The only time I ever see it is with a dynamic SQL associated with a reference cursor. Remember the continue and exit syntax associated with that simple loop. Again, not very commonly used. Our next flow control syntax was associated with the while loop. Remember that that guy typically gets executed one more time after the conditional, so be cautious using that guy. I never use him. I use a for loop instead and get explicit with respect to things, but it's up to you. You do it if you like. Speaking of for loops, that was our next flow control structure. We began with an explicit range for loop control variable in x dot dot y loop, and then the loop contents. Very common stuff. Moved on to for variable or for record in cursor, explicitly defined loop, and then you've got access to that record type within the loop. Finally, for record type in a select statement loop. That's my favorite. That's the one I'm using all the time, for most instances, because it makes a great deal of sense, at least for me. And it is almost self-documenting, so very common usage. Okay, guys, that puts a bow on PLSQL flow control. I know most of this was review for you, but hey, we have to go through it for those who haven't seen it for a while or have been less exposed. So remember, the biggest thing for me is that else-if weird syntax, weird spelling, and the nice use of an implicit cursor in a for loop. Those are handy dandy things. Hey, we'll see you in the next lecture, and you go out there and have some fun in the interim, but learn something new every day.